One night, 3 years ago, I fell asleep while praying. And my prayers, they went something like this. Lord, what do you want me to do? Give me some clarity. Is this a good direction? Should I keep going or should I turn back? Are we as a church doing okay, Lord? Anyone else ask God these kinds of things at all? I fell asleep, and then in the morning I woke and I read the Bible reading for that day from the Bible in 1 year, and it was from Psalm 82, one of our readings for this morning, and it was like God was answering my questions from the previous night. I read this: defend the weak and the orphan, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. I was in awe. I was sure that God had answered my prayers. I remember thinking, in life and in ministry, I want to keep an eye on the people who haven't got much, the people in pain, the people who are bullied. I'm going to look for ways to stand with them. And I haven't done that perfectly. That was 3 years ago now. And looking back now, a tad older, just a tad, I can see the risk that my heart could get harder. I wonder if you've noticed that in yourself or thought about that yourself. I can see the risk that my heart could get harder. I might lose my sensitivity. I might become callous. I might lose the clarity that I got that morning when I read the words, defend the weak. I might lose my sensitivity to injustice. We're going to hear the whole of that psalm now and then listen to one of Jesus' most popular and well-known parables. And please don't switch off in that parable just because it's familiar. Consider how the parable is linked to the psalm. So I'm reading from Psalm 82. A psalm of Asaph. God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God. Judge the earth. For all the nations are your inheritance. And then Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, the parable of the Good Samaritan. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbour? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." In Psalm 82, that first reading, the writer of the psalm, a man called Asaph, paints us a picture of a court scene. The God of Israel is taking the so-called gods of the ancient Near East to court. God asks them, "How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked?" God is accusing the lower G gods of permitting human injustice. If these gods are all right with injustice, then they are surely not gods at all. They are idols. It says that they will fall down like mere mortals. True religion leads human beings to defend the weak and the orphan, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy. Without those things, a religion is bankrupt. The gods are idols. There's no life. We go on to hear that these so-called gods, they know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. The idea is that these gods, they don't perceive injustice. They are not sensitive to it. They are callous, insensitive to justice. They are unlike the God of Israel, who heard the groans of his people enslaved in Egypt and said, "Let my people go." But these gods let injustice continue unchecked, and it wreaks havoc with the created order. The foundations of the earth are shaken. The foundations of the earth are shaken. Injustice shakes the earth. Another way of reading this psalm is to interpret the word gods as human rulers. A lot of human rulers in the ancient world were seen as gods or sons of the Most High. Perhaps then God is accusing human rulers or politicians of permitting injustice and failing to uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Good politics delivers the weak from the hand of the wicked. Bad politics turns a blind eye. I'll leave you to make connections, or not, with how UK politics has imploded in the last week. So in Psalm 82, whether the idea is that God is taking to court callous idols or callous political figures, the message is the same. Injustice shakes the earth. Injustice leads to disruption, chaos, ecological disaster. And if Psalm 82 gives us the kind of aerial view of injustice, then the parable of the Good Samaritan gives us the street view. The aerial view and the street view. The street view, we hear of a man who was going down to Jerusalem from Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, went away, leaving him half dead. He was treated unjustly. He was oppressed. He fell into the hands of the wicked. There was no one to defend him. He was left half dead by callous people. This man's world was shaken by injustice. Injustice shakes the earth, but injustice also shakes the world of just one person. And then the injustice is compounded by the inaction of the religious people who see him on the road. A priest passes by on the other side, so too are Levites. They were probably concerned about becoming defiled by a dead body. Ritual purity came before mercy in their understanding of religion. They didn't comprehend God's words through the prophet Hosea, where God says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So in Psalm 82, we hear about injustice shaking the earth. And in the parable, we hear about injustice shaking one person's world. So how about our world today? Because we've always got to make that leap from the text to today. In our world today, I wonder if the statement, "injustice shakes the earth," might prompt us to think of climate change and the extreme weather it causes and how the impact of climate change is intertwined with injustice. Research, let me share with you this research by Oxfam. It showed that the world's richest 10% of people cause 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. And not only that, but this group also claim over half of the world's wealth and tend to live in more secure countries that are less vulnerable to extreme weather conditions like this one. Although we are about to have a heat wave and we have had floods, and yet, despite those floods, we have insurance policies and there is help and things like that. So we're more secure, but others not so much. So the average person in the UK, let's say me, I emit 65 times more carbon compared to someone in, say, Malawi. But it's the person in Malawi that is pushed further into poverty by climate change. Is that fair? Injustice shakes the earth. Injustice shakes the earth. It shakes the foundations of the earth. Justice. And I realise that I participate in this injustice. I am part of the problem. And while part of me might want to say, well, so long as me and my family and my friends and my church are okay in the UK, then that's okay. But I'm convicted by Jesus' answer to the question, who is my neighbour? Because Jesus explains that the question is not, who is my neighbour, but who can I be a neighbour to? If there's something, anything I can do to alleviate the suffering of my neighbours around the world, shouldn't I? Injustice shakes the earth. But as we saw in the parable of the Good Samaritan, injustice can shake one person's world. There are so many different illustrations I could give at this point, but since it's Pride weekend here in Worthing, let me share some statistics from a YouGov poll about hate crime and discrimination of LGBT people in Britain. So this is here. This was from a few years ago, but I can imagine the results would still be fairly similar. I'd hope that there'd be some improvement, but probably fairly similar. 1 in 5 LGBT people have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their sexual orientation or gender identity in the last 12 months. So that's 20% of those surveyed. 2 in 5 trans people have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity in the last 12 months. That's 40%. And I think this is significant. 4 in 5 anti-LGBT hate crimes and incidents go unreported, with younger LGBT people particularly reluctant to go to the police. So that's 80% of those incidents don't go to the police. The year that data was collected, the government released the official figures and said that 0.3% of adults in general were victims of hate crime in the last 12 months. Now, obviously, those two sets of data have been collected in a very different way. I'm not ignorant of that, but we also have to recognise that the official data is about what was reported. And we see with the YouGov poll that 80% of the incidents were probably not reported. So it's obviously hard comparing these statistics, but I think we see a big problem here. 0.3% and 20% is quite a difference. And that's in this country that's seen as so progressive, where we can have pride events and all the freedom that in our law as well. But around the world, as many of you know, it's not the same. LGBT people don't have the same freedom. Often because of the way Christian or Muslim biblical scriptural texts have been interpreted and then influenced the laws. And that was the same in this country right up into fairly recent history. For this reason, among other reasons, I think people of faith have this special responsibility, to work for justice for all LGBT plus people, and for affirming churches like this one to not hide and shy away, but to keep just existing and trying to be a safe place and do our best. We'll get it wrong sometimes, but let's just do our best and keep trying to challenge the status quo. within Worthing, but globally as well. We need to refuse to pass by on the other side. Through climate change, injustice shakes the earth. Through hate crime targeted at LGBT people, injustice, it can shake one person's life, and that is important, even just shaking one person's life. Let's be sensitive to that. We can't afford to harden our hearts. We cannot pass by on the other side of the road. God says through Psalm 82, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. So that's all the bad news right there. But there is hope in these texts. The good news in Psalm 82, it comes right at the end, that final verse. And it might not sound like good news to you, and that's fine. But we read there, rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. We associate the word judge with kind of bad news. But it is good news here. Because while the gods or the human rulers turn a blind eye to injustice and let it continue unchecked, God will not. While the so-called gods are callous and hard-hearted, God is sensitive to the cries of the poor and the oppressed and is tender-hearted. God's judgment is God turning on the lights on injustice and saying, that is not okay. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, can make sense of what we've just read. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel 34, we find God passing judgment on the selfish rulers of Israel who are failing to shepherd the flock with diligence and care. God says, if you are not going to look after my sheep properly, you're fired. I'll care for them myself. I will show mercy. If you will not show mercy, I will, God says. Injustice shakes the earth, but mercy restores balance. And if those charged with the responsibility to act justly and mercifully are callous, then God will bypass the usual channels and go directly or through others to hurting people with his mercy. We see that most clearly, God going directly to those who are hurting in Jesus Christ. We see that so clearly because at around that time, religion, it could often be hypocritical and burdensome. Rather than lifting weights off people, it was putting an extra weight on people. So God came in Jesus, God in the flesh, and went about teaching people and healing people. And finally lifted their burdens at the cross so that they could walk forgiven and free. God came to the people. God bypassed the usual channels of mercy to come and be merciful. God bypasses the usual channels of mercy when they get clogged up, when they are clogged up. And we see essentially the same thing in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We find the pious religious people pass by on the other side, and because they don't step up, the mercy comes instead through a Samaritan. And that's a good word now. We had the Samaritans in the Pride Parade yesterday. That's a good word, the Samaritans, a Samaritan. But back then, the Jews and the Samaritans, they didn't get on. So a Samaritan was an outsider, was a heretic, was an enemy. Jesus' story would have been shocking at the time. Samaritans and Jews, they did not get on. They were not good neighbours. They viewed each other with suspicion. And so the kind of punchline, as it were, of Jesus' story is that mercy didn't come through the priest and the Levites, but the mercy of God had to find another way, and it came through a Samaritan because that Samaritan was willing to be a neighbour to the man who needed help. The man's world was shaken by injustice, but the mercy of God came through the Samaritan and restored balance to his life. As we considered earlier, through climate change, injustice shakes the earth. Through hate crime targeted at LGBT people, injustice, it can shake one person's world. And I realise that those are just two examples, an aerial view and a street view. And there are plenty of other justice issues. You might be thinking, why is Peter not mentioning the one I care about? Human trafficking, or political corruption, or religious persecution, or violence and discrimination towards women and girls, and people of colour, and those with disabilities. The list, it seems endless. And some of these may weigh heavier on our hearts than others, and it often depends on who we are and what our experiences in life are. Perhaps climate change and those who are suffering from the difficult weather conditions, it just seems so far away to us. Or it might be that we struggle to believe that hate crime towards LGBT people is as common as those stats suggest. But conversely, you might be acutely aware of misogyny or racism in the workplace, for example, or elsewhere, because you've witnessed it perhaps, or you've experienced it, or you have close friends who have. And often when an issue of injustice, it weighs heavy on our heart, we often think, why aren't the political leaders and the religious leaders talking about it? Why aren't they doing more? And I get that frustration. I really get that frustration. And I also realise that you might think I'm not talking about certain things enough. And there's that kind of difficulty, trickiness there as well. And there's different things we can do. We try and get the attention of religious leaders and political leaders. We might write to our MPs, and that's really good. I'm not trying to discredit that. Please keep doing that. We might sign petitions and things like that to try and get it talked about in the House of Commons, or you might write a letter to me or Mike and say, can we speak about this? Or here's a newsletter about blah, blah, blah. That's all good. Keep doing that. But I wonder if we need to just take our attention off human effort for a moment and refocus on God. God is sensitive to injustice. God cares for the oppressed. God is always just and merciful. And just because political or religious leaders often care less than they should, it's no reflection on who God is. Because divine power and human power, they're not aligned how we think they might be aligned. If human rulers, as we saw in the psalm, are kind of hard-hearted, God will find another way, another channel for mercy. It reminds me of what we looked at last week, actually. For those of you who were here, we looked at the story of Naaman. Naaman was powerful, a commander, had all the power in the story, and yet it was the humble, ordinary people that helped him find healing. It was the lambs that moved the story forward, not the wolf. In the same way, God will restore balance to the world through whoever is willing to be a channel of his mercy. We don't need to wait for the day when the hearts of political and religious leaders soften, because God wants to use you as a channel of his mercy today. You willing? Are you up for this? Here's just some ideas how we can get going with this. Start by focusing on God's merciful character and God's concern for justice. We've already done a bit of that this morning. Then, secondly, ask God to shape you in a certain way, to develop in you a merciful character and concern for justice. And then start looking for people who are hurting, wherever they happen to be. People in front of us, people elsewhere too. And then, the final step, if someone is in trouble and there's a way you can immediately help or get help, do so. If not, get to know them. Learn more about the specific injustice, because we can race to action, but sometimes we just need to listen and learn. Learn about the specific injustice and partner with others to help. Partner with others, because often things are already happening. There's so much happening in Worthing. There's so much happening to tackle injustice and extend mercy. Grassroots movements, protests, organisations, charities. Some of it started with Christians, some of it hasn't. Just because much of it happens outside of the church and we're not aware of it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Doesn't mean that God's not working. If the church is not a channel for God's mercy, then God will find another way. And that is so humbling. Goes back to last week. Humility, it's not about me, it's not about us. God will find another way. And I find that actually so exciting, because it means that God is not bound by the limits of the church. The challenge for us often is to find out where God is challenging injustice and extending mercy through people in our world today, and then once we've found God at work, to join God in that work. And that is why we don't, as Worthing Baptist Church, we don't try and organise everything and make our church become the centre of everything. The important thing, why we keep coming back to this, is we want to keep ourselves unclogged, as it were. Unclogged so that God's mercy can be channeled through us, wherever we are. When we gather here, but also when we scatter at work, home, in the community, let's keep ourselves unclogged. If there's anything that this sermon can do, maybe it means you go to God and say, I need unclogging, so that mercy can be channeled through me. If that's all that this sermon is about, then that is great. You don't even need to believe in God to still want your heart to be unclogged so that mercy can be channeled through you. So to draw this together, injustice shakes the earth, but mercy restores balance. God will not let injustice continue unchecked. God is always tender-hearted and merciful. And if we are not channels for God's mercy, God will work through others. If political leaders and religious leaders are callous, then God will work through unlikely people in unlikely places to challenge injustice and extend mercy. The big question is, do we want to be part of what God is doing? God's merciful action. Will we refocus on God's justice and mercy today? Will we ask God to develop in us a just and merciful character? Will we look out for hurting people and be sensitive to them? And finally, will we take some sort of action? Will we help and partner with others to help? So may the God of justice unclog us so that we can be channels of divine mercy.